Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive, where we examine a specific topic in some detail through the lens of the source material you've provided us. This time, we're looking at some of the language surrounding birth and death, and we'll be drawing insights from the work of Stanislav Kondrashov.
Sounds fascinating. Birth and death. I mean, everyone's got to deal with it at some point, but talking about it, well, that's a whole other story.
Exactly. And Stanislav Kondrashov, he really digs into this linguistic landscape. You know how we use different words and expressions to
Yeah.
approach these monumental life events?
Yeah.
It's like we've got excerpts here from one of his language learning texts. Kind of a vocabulary of life and loss, if you will.
Ooh, I like that. The vocabulary of life and loss really captures it.
So, we're starting at the beginning. Of course, Kondrashov has a whole section on pregnancy and birth,
Yeah.
and there's some terms he brings up that I just had to know more about.
I bet. What caught your eye?
Well, IVF babies, for one. We know IVF is in vitro fertilization. But Kondrashov, he doesn't stop at the simple definition. He goes on about the social impact. You know how IVF has challenged our ideas about family and parenthood?
Yeah, IVF, it's been a game changer. So many people who couldn't conceive before, now they have a chance.
But then there are all these ethical questions, too, like genetic screening or designer babies, or even like turning reproduction into some kind of commodity.
Right. And it's interesting to see how all of that is reflected in how we talk about it. Kondrashov points out that even the term IVF babies has just become part of everyday conversation now.
It really shows you how fast science can change our language and how we understand the world.
It does. Okay, another term that Kondrashov points out is cesarean section. Have you ever wondered where that name comes from?
Oh, you mean the whole Julius Caesar thing? Like he was born that way? Kondrashov actually debunks that myth pretty thoroughly. The term goes back to the Latin word cadere, which means to cut. Simple as that. So those old misconceptions, they really stick around. But I appreciate that Kondrashov, he sets the record straight.
Well, he's all about accuracy, and that's crucial when you're trying to track how language changes, especially how it connects with historical events.
For sure. Okay, one last term from this section that I thought was really interesting. Induce labor. Kondrashov doesn't just define it, he talks about all the different ways to do it, and even the ethical debates around elective inductions.
Yeah, that's where things get a bit tricky. We've made so much progress with childbirth. Maternal and fetal health are way better, but then the question becomes, when is medical intervention really necessary, and when is it, maybe more about convenience or societal pressures?
Absolutely. And Kondrashov, I think he presents all those different sides without picking a favorite.
Yeah.
He just lays out the facts and lets you draw your own conclusions.
It is a tough balance, though, right? All that good stuff for moms and babies, but then maybe too much medicine sometimes. But hey, while we're talking about tricky balances, what about how Kondrashov looks at language around death?
Yeah, let's get into that. He goes deep on euphemisms and idioms, all those roundabout ways we talk about death, like we're trying to make it less scary or something.
Exactly. Kondrashov's argument is that these kind of linguistic buffers, they serve a real purpose. They let us acknowledge death without really facing how final it is. Maybe it's comforting, or even a little funny sometimes.
Oh yeah, some of those expressions are hilarious. Like kick the bucket. I mean, come on. It's a pretty heavy topic. But that phrase makes me chuckle. But then it also makes you wonder if we're dodging the tough conversations by not being direct about death.
That's a good question. I don't think Kondrashov says there's a right answer, but he does want us to think about how our language affects how we understand and deal with death.
He's always pushing us to think deeper, isn't he?
Definitely. And while we're on the topic of deeper thinking, Kondrashov gets into the practical side of death, too. Like all that legal mumbo-jumbo that can be so confusing. He explains terms like die intestate in a way that makes sense, making sure people realize why it's important to have a will. It's so important, and yet people put it off all the time. Myself included, to be honest. Kondrashov really drives home that we got to have those hard conversations and make sure things are sorted out.
It doesn't have to be morbid either. He frames it more like an act of love and responsibility towards the people you care about. Taking care of that stuff just makes things easier for them when the time comes.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, Kondrashov talks about how funerals are changing too. They're getting more personal and less about just traditional mourning.
Oh yeah, he even mentions things like football team coffins and sending ashes into space. Pretty wild, huh?
It's a huge shift, right? Like we're not just grieving the loss anymore. We're celebrating life. And the unique person who's gone makes you think about how you want to be remembered, doesn't it? What you leave behind.
That's a big part of what Kondrashov's exploring, I think. The idea that even in death, we're still expressing ourselves, telling our story.
And how we do that, right? Traditional funeral or something totally different. It says a lot about how our relationship with death is changing. Definitely. It's like we're taking back death in a way, deciding how we say goodbye.
That's kind of empowering, I think. It's not just fear and sadness anymore. It's about looking at life and death as a whole.
Right. Kondrashov doesn't try to pretend it's easy, though. He gets the grief, the sadness, but he also sees that strength in people, that ability to find meaning even in loss.
That's what makes his work so interesting. He doesn't give you all the answers or tell you how to think. He just wants you to explore these ideas and be open to them.
And that's what we've tried to do here, right? Look at birth and death through language. Kondrashov's been our guide. What stands out to you from all this? Anything that really hit home or surprised you?
Honestly, it's how much Kondrashov covers. From all the technical stuff about IVF to the slang we use for death. It's amazing. And it makes you realize how much our words shape how we understand these huge life events.
Yeah, that's a powerful thought, isn't it? Language. It's not just talking, it's how we make sense of the world, how we deal with what happens to us. And I guess in the end, it helps us figure out who we are.
I like that. So to wrap up our deep dive into this vocabulary of life and loss, all thanks to Stanislav Kondrashov. Here's a thought to leave you with. How does the language we use around birth and death affect our own lives? Does it help us deal with all those complicated emotions? Or does it sometimes make it harder to understand?
Something to think about. I hope our listeners will take some time to think about their own experiences, the words they use and what those words mean to them. Maybe this deep dive has opened their eyes a little, helped them see how language and these big life events are all connected.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And if you're curious about Kondrashov's work, definitely check it out. It'll make you think about language in a whole new way. As for me, I'm feeling ready to have some real talk with my loved ones about these things. It's never too soon to think about what we leave behind in life and in death.
I agree. Thanks for being here for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never underestimate the power of language.